Well, welcome back for another video that's being released quite soon after a previous one. This was not a planned video that I had planned to do at all, but this morning when I uploaded my previous video, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk from Revolution to Armistice, I noticed a video posted on r slash breadtube called Noam Chomsky, Lenin in the USSR and Predictions at Bakunin. Decided to watch it, see what it was like. Everything previously I've seen from Chomsky about Lenin and the Soviet Union's been particularly unimpressive, to say the least. So, having watched this video, I got kind of irked, partially because everything that's wrong in it is stuff I intend to do videos about in the future, but it's probably going to be literally months before I can get to some of these points. So I just kind of felt inspired to do a response video, which I think I remember when I was planning out the whole channel, I said to myself I'd never do this sort of thing, but, well, here we are. So this is going to be much less scripted than my previous videos. I'm still going to use historical sources, but instead of providing a script, I'm just going to acknowledge what book I'm reading from, and I'm just going to pull quotes directly from the various sources I have here on hand. And I'll tell you the name of the book so that you can, and the page number, so you can go look this up yourself. So I'm going to post clips of the video. I can't really dig into all the points or as in-depth as I would like to, but I think that's just a limitation of the format. But thankfully, this should be one of my shorter videos. So I'm going to take some clips out of it. I'll put the full video in the description so you can make sure I'm not lying about what Chomsky says, but I'm going to be pretty much putting the whole thing. So let's dive in.
The Leninist system was one of the greatest blows that socialism suffered in the 20th century, maybe second only to fascism. I mean, as Lenin took power, among its first acts, along with Trotsky, were to destroy the socialist institutions that had arisen in the pre-Bolshevik period. Soviets, factory councils, constituent assembly, which was dominated by left social revolutionaries, largely peasant-based. And of course, they went to war against the anarchists, a major war to try to wipe them out, the Makhno's army and so on. And there was a sort of a logic behind it.
40 seconds in, Chomsky has already made a lot of claims, including trying to label all socialist states as Leninist states, as if there's a direct sort of continuity between Lenin and the policies of Cuba, of the later Soviet Union, of China, of Vietnam, as if this was all directly a product of Lenin's vision. We also see him claim that once the Bolsheviks took power, that they had shut down all these things. Boom, day one, the Soviets disappeared. The Constituent Assembly, which Chomsky claims existed before the revolution, which it did not. And the idea that the factory councils had been shut down right away. All of these are wrong. I'm going to show that here in a minute. I think this is a particular dishonesty that I see a lot of people use, as if trying to paint some of the events that happened years later, that happened directly after 1917, and completely devoiding them of their historical context. This is especially seen with how he talks about Makhno, as if right after the revolution they had invaded the peaceful anarchist Ukraine, and that there hadn't already been, tons of conflicts. The anarchists raiding trains and various other things. But first I want to focus on something. The connections that he makes between Lenin and the later Soviet Union, really Lenin and Stalin. This has sort of become a truism that I see spouted a lot, that, just directly from Lenin leads to Stalin. As if there wasn't a lot of conflict between Lenin and Stalin, as if there wasn't a lot of conflict even within the Communist Party after that, between the left opposition and the right opposition. There was not this just direct continuation of political will of the same ideas continuing forward. This is really something that got spouted a lot in earlier Cold War history of the Soviet Union. Luckily, when exactly this started is a little difficult, but the modern revisionist school of Soviet history, and I want to remind people that within historical terms, revisionism isn't inherently bad. Revisionism to make history more accurate is good, and that's what the various members of this school did. People like Cohen, Bukharin's biographer, people like Alexander Rabinovich, Sheila Fitzpatrick, Moshe Lewin, and various other authors were all part of this school that presented I think, a more truthful, honest look at the Soviet Union, backing away from the totalitarian model and the idea that there's a direct continuation between Lenin and Stalin. And I'm going to pull from Moshe Levin's Lenin's Last Struggle for most of the next couple, next minute or two. And I think he kind of states this really well at the beginning, this sort of idea that's become this sort of a truism. After Lenin died, he was replaced by Stalin, and soon one of the most tenacious of the propagandist labels began to be heard, becoming in many quarters almost a canon of faith, namely that Lenin and Bolshevism begot Stalin and Stalinism, an easy-to-remember simplifier that seems to explain everything when in fact has nothing to do with a reality that is so much more complicated, and let us add, more interesting. If this claim was true, why did Stalin work so hard to actually physically destroy most of the Bolshevik cadres? It was little known and seldom noticed that the relationship between Lenin and Stalin during Lenin's last 2 years were not just tense, but characterized by hostility so profound that only Lenin's physical decline prevented him from demoting Stalin from his post of Secretary General, if not expelling him from the party altogether. The two men became almost open political enemies, and this is why anyone who might have known this fact, the whole of the Bolshevik organization, was exterminated, and there was no need to speak seriously about a political party at all. So I'm going to quickly try to run through some of the events where Lenin's really starting to come into conflict with some parts of the party, and particularly with Stalin. I'm going to be polling mostly for Moshe Levin's Lenin's Last Struggle, pretty much almost entirely for this part, because, it's what the book's about, so it makes it useful to cite from. With the implementation of the NEP replacing war communism, towards the end of 1921, there started to form a debate around how exactly foreign trade would be handled. Currently, the policy was towards a monopoly on foreign trade. The state would act as an in-between any of the local capitalists, mostly the rural peasantry, and the external capitalists to try and prevent there from being influence on the other. However, a lot of the parties started moving to get rid of this, especially Bukharin, Sokolnikov, and Frumkin really started moving against it. Stalin was partially in favor of also getting rid of the monopoly on foreign trade. At this point, however, through about May of 1922, Lenin remained healthy and was able to defend this position himself. Lenin's policy on this was adopted on May 22nd by the Politburo. However, soon after, Lenin became sick, and during that time, the government then quickly moved to getting rid of the monopoly on foreign trade whilst Lenin was sick in a way. Once Lenin started to get better by about October of that year, he wanted a new vote to be put on so that he could reverse the policy and go back to having a monopoly on foreign trade. Eventually, he was able to win the ability to have a vote from Stalin. However, Lenin was still pretty sick, so it required him to reach out to Trotsky, and on December 12th, Lenin contacted Trotsky for them to work together on this and come so that he could come in defense of Lenin's position on monopoly of foreign trade. Lenin said to Trotsky, "At any rate, I earnestly ask that you take upon yourself at the coming plenum to defense of our common opinion." Between December 12th and 15th, the two men corresponded with each other at great length. On page 39, on December 15th, Lenin concluded, "Comrade Trotsky, I think we have arrived at full agreement. I ask you to announce their solidarity at the plenum." In a postscript, he added, he strongly rejected any attempt to equivocate and adjourn the debate once more. Under the pretext of his illness and the importance of waiting until he could take part in himself in the discussion, I should be 10,000 times more upset by a delay which would make completely unstable our policy upon one of the fundamental questions. The same day, in a letter to Stalin and other members of the Central Committee, he announced that he had taken the necessary steps to retire, and it had caused quite a sensation. As well, in the letter, he declared that he had come to an agreement on Trotsky so that Trotsky could defend his position on the monopoly of foreign trade. From page 40. On December 18th, the Central Committee in a plenary session annulled its previous decision, which had caused Lenin so much anxiety. Stalin had given in all along the line. This was already his usual tactic whenever he felt himself in an inferior position. Lenin, now bedridden but delightfully with his success, congratulated Trotsky warmly. "It seems we have captured the position without firing a shot. By mere movements of maneuver, I propose that we should not stop but continue the attack." The next time that they would come into conflict was over the plan for the whole of the Soviet Union. From page 50. "We must achieve," he says, "a federation of republics enjoying equal rights. In order to guarantee this equality, he deleted from Stalin's plan the paragraph relating to an adhesion of republics to the RSFSR and proposed in its place a formal union with the Russian Republic and a union of Soviet republics of Europe and Asia. The Russian government would not be that of the Union. Lenin proposed the creation of a federal executive committee of the Union of Soviet Republics." So, primarily, Stalin was for the Russian government becoming the head of the new union, where Lenin wanted an entirely separate that would sit over the Russian government to allow equal representation of all the republics of the union. Stalin would then fire back at Lenin in his own letter. I don't want to read this whole thing because otherwise this video is going to go on forever. At some point I am going to come back around to discuss the debates at this time. Really everything I talk about in this video I plan at some point to do like a proper long video on each of these. October 6th, the Central Committee adopted the new version that contained some of Lenin's changes and some of Stalin's changes. Lenin was unable to attend due to being sick. However, Lenin wrote to Kamenev this letter. Comrade Kamenev, I declare war to the death on dominant national chauvinism. I shall eat it with all my healthy teeth. As soon as I get rid of this accursed bad tooth, I must absolutely insist that the union of central executive committees be presided over in turn by a Russian, Ukrainian, Georgian, etc. Absolutely yours, Lenin. Lenin managed to win this argument, and the Central Committee adopted his project in its entirety, and instead the Russian government would not rule over the whole of the Union. The next big conflict that drew out of this, and I don't have time to go into the full depth of the Georgian affair, it's a really in-depth topic, but generally at this point, the Georgian Bolsheviks who had come into power after the invasion of Georgia were against being incorporated into the Transcaucasian Federation and instead wanted to remain independent like Ukraine and Belarus were. At the beginning of this affair, Lenin did not give it proper attention. It was not until later. Lenin would eventually fall ill and sort of drop the issue, and really initially, upon hearing about it, he was not Lenin as well was not necessarily favorable to the Georgian Bolsheviks initially. However, by March 5th, upon getting some new information, Lenin had dictated a letter with the instruction that it be read over the telephone to Trotsky. The content of this letter I'm going to read out. It's on page 99 of Lenin's Last Struggle. I earnestly ask that you undertake the defense of the Georgian affair at the Central Committee of the party. That affair is now under persecution at the hands of Stalin and Dzhernitsky. I cannot rely on their impartiality. Indeed, quite contrary. If you would agree to undertake this defense, I could be at rest. If for some reason you do not agree, send me back the papers. I will consider that a sign of your disagreement. With the very best comradely greetings, Lenin. Trotsky had replied in the affirmative that he would take up this issue. Trotsky, upon receiving the documents from Lenin, suggested that they be shown to Kamenev so that he might take certain measures on the spot. Lenin had one of his secretaries respond to Trotsky. It is entirely out of the question. Vladimir Ilyich says that Kamenev would show the letters to Stalin, and Stalin would make a rotten compromise in order to then deceive. Lenin then wrote a letter to the Georgian Bolsheviks that was given to both Trotsky and Kamenev. It states his intention to prepare notes and a speech in their defense. Trotsky was shocked by Lenin's sudden change in his opinion. He had gone from wanting to defend looking into the affair to the explicitly the Georgian Bolsheviks must be defended against Stalin. Trotsky then asked one of Lenin's secretaries, and they stated, it is probably because Vladimir Ilyich is getting worse and is in a hurry to do what he can. Trotsky had also been told that Vladimir Ilyich was preparing a bomb against Stalin. On March 7th, Kamenev was told that Vladimir Ilyich was preparing to crush Stalin politically. Later that day, though, however, Lenin suffered another serious attack. On March 10th, half his body was then paralyzed. He never recovered the power of speech. Lenin then was never able to carry out the bomb he had been preparing against Stalin or crush him politically, as he stated his intentions a few days before what effectively was Lenin's death. Now, there's a whole lot more I could go over. However, this is already getting kind of long, but I think this makes my point clear. There is not a direct continuation of Stalin and Lenin. There is very clearly during the last 2 years of Lenin's life, and especially the last few days of his life, that he was preparing to have Stalin probably removed from the party altogether. So to move on to Chomsky's statement that the factory councils were shut down shortly after 1917 from the Bolsheviks from the top down. So I'm going to be calling from S.A. Smith's Red Petrograd, Revolution in the Factories, 1917 through 1918, which includes a history of these factory councils. What I'm pulling from is on the bottom of page 82, page 83, so you can check to make sure I'm not lying. Western historians have placed considerable emphasis on the local and decentralized aspects of the factory committee movement, but their depiction of a diffuse centrifugal movement harnessed after October into centralist demands is in need of a qualification. For whilst the committees were characterized by greater decentralization and local autonomy than the trade unions from the first, there were pressures towards centralization and higher level coordination within the movement. Centralization was not imposed from above by a triumphant of Bolshevik government. It arose from below at the behest of the committees themselves. The factories themselves, in fact, I'm not quoting now, had in fact themselves started to work with other factories to form higher-level councils to coordinate production, because at the time, industrial production within Russia was collapsing, and the factory committees knew that decentralized planning just didn't work. And it was, in fact, not the Bolsheviks who were pushing for a higher level of state control, but both the Menshevik and the SR parties. Again, this is from page 151 of Red Petrograd. The Menshevik and SR's demand for state control of the economy was preferred as a solution to the severe crisis racking Russian industry. And from further down the page, the official position of the SR party was very similar to the Mensheviks. They too believed in state control of the economy rather than in workers' control. Whereas the Bolsheviks' proposal, or at least as far as Lenin's opinion, though this certainly was not universal to the whole of the party, was the idea that the factory committees should elect members with the Soviets, the local Soviets, up to the national bodies that regulate the economy. Lenin's original proposal that 3/4 of the members on the economic planning committees should be made up of workers elected from below. So rather than this idea that Chomsky put forth that the Bolsheviks killed the workers' councils and that the rest of the party supported them, the funny thing is it's actually quite the opposite, where the Mensheviks and the SRs moved to destroy the workers' councils within the factory councils, and the Bolsheviks were for defending it, including Lenin, as well as continuing to use the Soviets to elect those bodies alongside the factory councils. So much for him also just shutting down the Soviets right away, as Chomsky presented. So on the claim that Chomsky makes that the Soviets were shut down, this really isn't the case. The Soviets continued to function through the Civil War. It is not incorrect, however, to suggest that they became less democratic and stopped functioning quite as they should due to the conditions of the Civil War. Lenin admitted this himself in March 1919. From Lenin's last struggle again. In March 1919, Lenin noted with deep regret, but with the greatest frankness, that because of the deplorable level of education among the masses, the Soviets, which according to their program were organs of government by the workers, are in fact only organs of government for the workers by the most advanced section of the proletariat and not by the working masses themselves. And actually, if we jump back, this is in Leninism under Lenin. In 1918, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs declared that local Soviets were thenceforth invested with all the power held by the former administration and added, the entire country must be covered with a network of new Soviets. So previously, the Soviets had been mostly exclusive to most of the major cities in European Russia. The phenomenon did not spread to the whole country through 1917. It wasn't until much later during 1918 that the Soviets actually spread, during the time that Chomsky claims that they were destroyed. And here we have from page 228 from Leninism under Lenin. The initial phase of the Soviet regime was a period of almost unrestricted autonomy of local bodies, animated by intense activity. The local Soviets, which continued to grow in numbers, showed themselves jealous in safeguarding their own authority. Further down the page, we start to talk about what caused the Soviets to start to fall apart, and certainly things weren't perfect. My point here is not the Soviets functioned perfectly and were perfect bastions of absolute worker democracy. They, in fact, did start to break down over the course of the Civil War, but rather than, as Chomsky presents, them being shut down the day after the Bolsheviks took power, they, in fact, dissolved slowly over the course of the Civil War, not from above, but from below. Not until the autumn of 1918 did these basic authorities start to disintegrate rapidly. What ended them was not so much the will of the central authority as the exigencies and consequences of the Civil War. Until then, the power of the Soviets, especially on the local plane, had been almost undivided, in any case greater than that of the Bolshevik Party. Within a few months, this power now collapsed. The White Terror was partially responsible for this, of course, since victories by the counter-revolutionary forces were usually accompanied by not only the massacring of large numbers of communists, but also the extermination of most of the active members of the Soviets. In any case, the suspension of the latter, as well as some parts of the Soviet government quit really recognizing the local Soviets. The Cheka began ignoring the powers of the local Soviets and butting heads with the military revolutionary committees. So towards the end of 1918, and certainly through 1919, the Soviets did very much start to break down. However, in 1920, there began to be some revitalization of the Soviets for a short time. Julius Martov, an old Menshevik comrade of Lenin's, actually thought at that time that the Mensheviks could be brought back into the government and back into the Soviets. However, this quickly came to an end as much of the brutality of the Civil War returned. With the Polish invasion as well as the resurgence of white counter-revolution, what was left of the Soviets pretty much evaporated. This combined with, over the course of the Civil War, much of Russia's cities had been depopulated. Moscow and Petrograd losing millions of populations to people fleeing to the countryside. Now, I'd kind of like to go into this part more, but this is going to have to wait for a later video. If you want to read some yourself, I highly recommend Leninism under Lenin. The part that starts on page 231, he dives into the interpretations of Lenin as a Machiavellian figure who is just determined to destroy democracy at every turn, and shows generally why this is false. And really, through much of the book, this sort of interpretation of Lenin. And now I'm just realizing I spent 20 minutes talking about 40 seconds of a YouTube video, so hopefully the rest of this goes a little bit quicker.
They were orthodox Marxists, unlike Marx, incidentally. They believed in a version of Marxism that said that revolution can't come in a backward peasant society, which is what Russia was. It was what we would now call a third world country, an undeveloped peasant society with some development, but owned by the West and so on. I mean, a highly educated and productive intellectual class, but that's also true of third world societies. So they thought this couldn't happen. So therefore we have to drive this backward population through industrialization by force, and then later on by the iron laws of history and so on and so forth will come to socialism. Of course, it's all nonsense, but so they essentially laid the basis for a totalitarian system with an ideological doctrine behind it. When the Soviet Union collapsed, I actually wrote an article saying this is a victory for socialism, small victory for socialism. I just couldn't get it published. Nobody knew what I was talking about. The world's two major propaganda systems, the West and the Soviet Union, they both determined to use the word socialism to refer to the totalitarian system of the Soviet Union. I mean, the West did it to discredit socialism. The Bolsheviks did it to try to gain, the credit associated with genuine socialism. Well, when the world's two propaganda systems agree, it's going to be very hard for people to extricate themselves from it. So now socialism, the term has been degraded to mean the form of totalitarianism instituted by Lenin, carried through by Stalin. And it was.
So I'm going to cut Chomsky off where he goes on to just mostly saying, here, this is why anarchism's correct. So again, he does this sort of dishonesty where he acts like two events directly followed each other. He talks of forced collectivization and forced industrialization as if they occurred right directly when the Bolsheviks took power, when in reality, these policies did not happen for another decade after the Bolsheviks took power. Chomsky also makes the outright silly claim that Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks thought revolution was impossible in a backwards country. There's actually a pretty easy way to determine if the Bolsheviks thought a revolution was possible in Russia, and it's because they did a revolution in Russia. They had one. We can even take the opinion of Trotsky from his work, The Permanent Revolution. Different countries will go through this process at different tempos. Backwards countries may, under certain conditions, arrive at the dictatorship of the proletariat sooner than the advanced countries, but they will come later to socialism. So much for Trotsky thinking that revolution, is impossible in backwards countries. In fact, a major theory of Trotsky's permanent revolution is stating, in fact, they will and very likely have revolutions before the more advanced countries. The funniest thing to me also is that he goes over the fact that, he talks to the propaganda of both the West and from the Soviet Union. And the funniest thing to me is the interpretation of history of the Soviet Union that Chomsky's following is very much one Stalin would have liked. The idea that he was the correct and they were directly following from where Lenin would have gone if he was still alive. This is the perspective Stalin wanted to be true, and it's very much the perspective that much of the capitalist powers want to be true. They present this caricature of Leninism so that really no leftists return back to this. And the funniest thing about all of this is really that Chomsky's just falling for this same propaganda that he's supposedly denouncing. There's a couple other little things that Chomsky mentions, like Spain, and I don't really want to spend time going into these. I think I've talked about the main points, and he doesn't really make a whole lot of specific claims. So that's really it for this video. This, like I said at the beginning, was not really planned. I also think I said this was going to be one of my shorter videos. I guess I lied. This is going to be one of my longer videos. But I think it really shows how 3 minutes of someone who's generally well-respected, Chomsky, just spreading these weird truisms, takes someone really like half an hour of explanation to show how they're wrong, and hours of research to. Granted, I've read all these books before, so I knew where I was looking for to find things in the books. But if you were someone wanting to verify if Chomsky's claims were true, this would have taken you probably well over a couple of weeks, spending hours per day reading through these history books, combing over them. And I think it kind of shows how even the smallest wrong claims can take such a long time to disprove. And to some extent, that is kind of why this isn't the style of video I wanted to make. I'd much rather take a subject that I know a lot of myths have been made about and do a long-form video explaining what has happened with lots of historical citations and let that disprove the various things rather than doing a bunch of one-off videos disproving points. However, I kind of saw this video and got grumpy and kind of wanted to make this video. I don't know if this gets a lot of views. Maybe this is something I'll try more often, but I would really prefer to stick to what I really want to do, which is just longer format history videos that, through virtue of them giving the correct history, disprove these claims. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hit the subscribe button. That's what you're supposed to do at the end of the video, right? I'm going to do another video probably right after this, talking about what my plans for the channel going forward. So, see you there.